Apologies all. There we go. My name is Nicole Siegel, and I am the Deputy Director of Education at Third Way, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. On behalf of my team and our partners at Excelencia in Education, thank you so much for joining us for this timely conversation on attaining Latino student success, Hispanic-serving institutions leading in economic mobility. Whether you are new to the higher education space or a veteran, chances are you're familiar with the controversy surrounding college ranking publications. While all rankings are not created equal, and some have made important strides in evolving their methodology, the reality is selectivity and historical prestige have long been prioritized over student outcomes. But if the primary purpose of post-secondary education is supposed to be to catalyze an increase in economic mobility for students, we need to elevate the schools that are actually succeeding in this goal, which is the reason we're all gathered here today. Because we know when colleges and universities enroll and graduate traditionally underserved students, society benefits. For today's run of show, we'll start by discussing Third Way's Economic Mobility Index, a new rating system for higher ed, followed by remarks from Deborah Santiago, co-founder and CEO of Excelencia in Education, about their research in this space, and a conversation that she will host with 3 administrators from top performing Hispanic-serving institutions across the country. Before we jump in, let me tackle a few housekeeping items. This conversation is on the record. It is being recorded. So if there are things you miss or will want to reference again, you will be able to do so at a link that will be posted on Third Way and Excelencia's website, fingers crossed, within the next 24 hours. Following our policy expert panel and conversations with HSI leaders, we will open the floor for Q&A. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And finally, my colleague, Emmy Navarro, will be sharing a variety of relevant resources throughout today's event in the chat. So you are able to save it for later using the instructions that will also be provided in the chat. With that, I would like to turn things over to my colleague, Lanae Erickson, Senior Vice President of Social Policy, Education, and Politics at Third Way, to talk about a new and different approach to assessing institutions of higher ed. Lanae, take it away.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and so excited to be here with this illustrious crew. So when Third Way entered the higher education space in 2015, we were laser focused on one thing, and that was improving student outcomes in our higher education system, particularly for the kinds of students that it has long underserved. So we thought that the federal conversation at the time was almost exclusively focused on access to higher education, which is super important, but not necessarily on student success. So what happened to the students once they were enrolled? And the press coverage of our higher education system was almost exclusively focused on a handful of elite schools that admit very few students overall, and frankly, a minuscule number of low-income students or students of color. So we have worked with a number of partners to try to help change that narrative. We started with our first mobility metric in 2016, looking at the newly released college scorecard data and trying to understand what it meant for how schools were serving students. So that metric weighted up a number of student outcomes, things like completion rates, earnings, repayment rate, along with net price and the percentage of students at a school receiving the Pell Grant, to ascertain which schools were actually providing the best return on investment for low-income students. Over the next few years, we continue to dig into the increasingly available student outcomes data that is out there to flesh out the answer to that question in a variety of ways, including through our creation of a price to earnings premium in 2020, which looked at how long it would take the average student to pay back their higher education investment based on the earnings boost they could expect from completing that program. We followed up that, what we call the PEP, price to earnings premium, with the PEP for low-income students, because we are very aware that some schools may have good outcomes for some, but really lousy outcomes for the student populations that have been traditionally underserved. And now we've built on that analysis with our latest Economic Mobility Index, what we've called the EMI, which ranks schools by how well they deliver on the promise of providing their students the ability to climb the economic ladder of success. While the price to earnings premium for low-income students was really interesting, many of the schools that topped that list on the metric were private selective schools that frankly admit very few low-income students. So how much mobility are they even really providing? The EMI adds the PEP for low-income students together with the percentage of Pell Grant students in a school's population to get a better overall sense of which schools are actually providing mobility to the most students across the country. Notably, not surprising to anyone on this Zoom, the schools shown to provide the most economic mobility were all Hispanic-serving institutions. All of them provided enough of an earnings premium for low-income students to recoup their educational costs in 2 years or less. And while mostly private selective schools that offered the best overall price to earnings premium for low-income students enrolled about 15,000 Pell recipients altogether, the top 10 schools on this metric that offer the most economic mobility enrolled almost 100,000. That's over 6 times as many per year. So we really wanted to highlight that incredible work and thought there was no one better to do it than Deborah. Deborah Santiago is the co-founder and chief executive officer of Excelencia in Education, America's premier authority on efforts accelerating Latino student success in higher education. She has an extensive higher education background and has led research and she has advanced evidence-based practices and strategies for more than 20 years at the national level, the state level, the institutional level, all to improve educational opportunities and success to better serve Latino and frankly all of today's students. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Deborah to talk about the success of these Hispanic-serving institutions in offering true mobility to students, and hopefully to provide us all some lessons on how we can push all colleges in our higher education system to do the same. Deborah?
Thanks, Lanae, and thank you all at Third Way for partnering with us for this important conversation. I want to add to Lanae's work, and thanks to Michael as well for putting this together and engaging in a conversation about how we measure what we value in higher education and how we need to look more overtly at the institutions that are disproportionately carrying the weight of providing value add and educating the students and the communities that we know need to seize the opportunity and the benefit of an education that fulfills kind of the American dream we all have, right? So that's why I appreciate focusing on Hispanic-serving institutions. As Lanae mentioned, at Excelencia, we've been focusing on the institutions that are intentionally serving Hispanic students. And many of them are Hispanic-serving institutions that have a defined role of concentrated enrollment for Hispanic students. I imagine many of you on this webinar know some of the background. I'm going to share it with you because I think the transition is understanding HSIs and the top 10. And then we're going to speak to 3 of our colleagues who represent those top 10 institutions using this economic mobility index, but then also thinking through what is it about the characteristics, but also what they're doing, because frankly, measuring what we value, knowing what institutions are making a difference, and knowing what they're doing to provide that difference, I think that's why we are committed to engaging in these kinds of conversations. And it's great to see so many of you joining us from across the country that know and are committed to this effort of work. So very quick snapshot about HSIs that grounds our thinking. So the numbers of institutions that meet this enrollment threshold of 25% or more undergraduate FTE, there are 559 in the latest analysis we've done, drop from previous years. And some of that's because of the challenges in enrollment with the pandemic and the economic environment we're in. But we still have about 20% of institutions in this country disproportionately enroll 65% of all Hispanic undergraduates in the country. And that is a really concentrated enrollment and the opportunity to see what they're doing, because they also disproportionately graduate Hispanic students. We see over almost 30% of Latino graduates come from HSIs, even though they represent about 20% of institutions. So thinking about that growth, we focus a lot more on institutions, not just because of demography and geography, but intentionality and impact. What are they doing to make sure the students are served and served well? And what leads, that explain the student success that we need to be thinking more robustly about when we look at indices and metrics like the ones that Lanae shared. So from our perspective, it's how do we take the data that we know are out there and tell an institution story that links data and practice. That's core, right? We know that the perspective we bring to this is that, higher education is supposed to be a catalyst to increase the economic mobility, the social mobility, and want to know, what are the institutions doing that? That's what this conversation is about today. At the policy level, this focus on prestige and selectivity, selecting out for issues of equity, doesn't always get us to the kind of social and economic mobility that we would expect to see. And that's why we value the kind of metric that's just being discussed. The other is taking a look at how do we think about the story of an institutional effort that tends to have less resources, students that have greater needs, and the opportunity to link the two. That's why we have this panel that's with us today. And I would like to jump to that because that's where we're going to get to the action. And then we can get into some of the questions I hope this will be generating for those of you that are active practitioners in the space, those of you that are researchers and thinking a lot about this and the strength of the tools, but also looking at the action and commitment to scale and serving our communities overall. With us, we've got three colleagues that I'd like to introduce one by one and then make sure that they join us. And so we can have a conversation about what they are doing, looking at this metric, but also in serving their students first and foremost. We have Fernando Delgado, who's the president of CUNY Lehman College. We have Hasson, the Interim Vice Provost at Fresno State University, and Magdalena Hinojosa, the Senior Vice President of Strategic Enrollment and Student Affairs at University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Thank you all for joining us and welcome. I wanted to start off by just giving the sense of those who are in this webinar about where these institutions are and the information that was shared for this, this tool, the EMI, Economic Mobility Index. University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley is ranked 4th in the country using this metric in the economic mobility it's providing to the students and the service area they're committed to. California State University, Fresno State is ranked 7th, and Lehman College 9th. And those rankings, I mean, if you're top 10, that speaks a great deal to the effort and commitment of these institutions to make sure that the service area that's disproportionately Hispanic, but that is also low income first gen, which we also disproportionately enroll, and students of color are served and served well. So maybe what I'd like to do is start with you, Fernando, if I may. You've seen this metric, this way of talking about economic mobility, and we know the commitment that you have as a leader and that Lehman has had for many years. From your perspective, could you just share with us a little bit about kind of what's the utility of this kind of a metric to help tell Lehman College's story of economic mobility and adding value to student success?
For us, it's an essential part of our brand and what we suggest would be our brand experience to our students. So we are in the northern edge of the Bronx. So we are by far the poorest, most poverty-stricken part of New York City. Many of our students struggle with making decisions about food, school, and travel. And unfortunately, when you're trying to go to school, food and travel are part of that. So they're having to make tough decisions for them and their families. And so our ability to partner with the state and private philanthropy to provide scholarships and support for these students, 50% of whom, 47 and change, are first generation, 83% of whom are either Hispanic or Black, and 89% are Pell eligible. This is a tough environment for those students to attend. And so for them to understand that their investment, their time and their resources and their talent to get to college will lead to social and economic mobility is key. And we see that frankly in the disciplines. I mean, our nursing program, for example, continues to just burst at the seams. We see rising interest in STEM. We are starting a school of business in a month. We'll be kicking it off. And so we see that demand from within the community, and we see the pressure points from within the community. And most of our students do come from the Bronx. We have a few students that come from Westchester County, which is more affluent and more suburban north of us. But we are by and large an institution of, by, and for the Bronx. And so economic mobility and being an economic driver is a key component of a student's perception of why they're going to go to college and why they would choose Lehman.
Yeah, thanks. You mentioned some of the opportunities. We often talk at Excelencia, a very asset-based approach. People talk about challenges and barriers, but you articulated some real opportunities to think about what you do a little bit differently. And I know that we've had the honor of working with our colleagues at Fresno State and Rio Grande Valley as well. So building on what Fernando shared, Alam, the work you all are doing and in Fresno, some of it's branding, but it's also meeting your students where you're at. How do you take a look at the challenges and opportunities of your students and make sure that they get that value add, that the mobility that we all seem to be craving?
Well, I think for us, a key part is really being integrated with our community and understanding the community needs and our student needs. So listening first, and recognizing that we have students from across the spectrum. We have students coming in with 60 units of transfer credit as freshmen, and then those that have never had an opportunity to take an AP class. And so taking the time to understand where they are and then building programs that meet our students where they are and start to develop them and move them on. And we're here from Fresno State, but from the rankings, we see that the CSU, the California State University, is well represented in the rankings. I don't think we're even in the top 3 of Cal States. And so this is really in the DNA of the California State University system and providing that access.
Yeah, I think 6 of the 10 are from Cal State, and I think 2 or 3 of the top 10 are in CUNY. So it speaks to public institutions with a service area focus and commitment as well. But these institutions and UT as well, UT-RGV, are not ranked highly in college rankings, the performance-based funding, other metrics. So from the work at UT-RGV and the work you all are doing, Maggie, how do you position UT-RGV and the critical work you're doing to show what your institute is doing to make a difference for the students enrolled and who've chosen to work with you?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you, Deborah, and thanks to Third Way for looking at our institutions in a different way, right? The work that Excelencia does, the work that Third Way is doing, really is bringing to light who we are as institutions and the fact that we do important work, and you don't have to be what is known as a traditional elite institution to really have successful students. And so I think the most important thing that we do at UT-RGV is that we don't do work in a silo. And too often, I think we find institutions who get into their own areas and don't venture out. We really do a lot of cross-divisional communication about what the needs are for our students, whether from an academic perspective to the things they need outside of the classroom, to more importantly, what's happening financially. And so we truly work as a team, similar to what my colleague said, listening to our students, but most importantly, listening to each other as an institution to ensure that we are all meeting the needs of our students.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for just starting this conversation, because we work at the national level and the public policy level, as well as listening and learning to all of you. And a big challenge is finding metrics and measures where I was looking for that silver bullet. What's the one data point that's going to tell me if this institution is to have an impact? But I think all three of you mentioned about the challenges, the complexity of meeting students where they're at, your service area, and the composition of your students, and how you're finding ways to meet these students, to meet their goals and aspirations. I'll start back with you, Fernando. You know, this metric, amongst other metrics, is capturing some of the value add that you provide that we aren't seeing in U.S. News World Report and these other efforts. How do you bring attention to the hard work you guys are doing that I think is kind of frontline of serving the growing post-traditional population? How do you identify the metrics and tell your story in a way that values these kinds of metrics and the students you're serving?
So in some ways, you're doing the work for us. And so by providing that metric, we tell our story through that third-party validation. And frankly, that third-party validation is more powerful than anything that we would come up with ourselves, because that might be seen as self-serving. And so, you know, we will never chase being on people's lists. But when people sort of reflect back on the data that they can call or that they pulled from us and say, this is what this institution looks to be doing, we'll pay attention to that. You know, I benefit by inheriting an institution. I'm just completing my first year that has a particular kind of DNA. And what really helps to sort of echo what my colleague said is that partnership and that collaboration that occurs on the campus comes from people who are incredibly competent, but also highly motivated by the mission and the purpose of the institution. And that helps. And so they and our students, and frankly, if you will, the consumers of our students, particularly in the metropolitan area that we live in, they're the most effective at telling our story. Because once they begin telling the story, all I have to do is echo it. I have to repeat it because it's no longer my story. It's people's stories about Lehman's impact. And I think it resonates far more authentically in that way because it has been verified by other people's experiences. And it's not simply something that I've narrated or created whole cloth. And so, you know, like I said, we don't fetishize the rankings, but when somebody says something that we're doing well or not so well, we pay attention to the why. Why are they saying that we're doing this right? Or why are they saying that we need to improve? Because that's something for us to consider.
Yeah, thank you. You know, the challenge, and you mentioned some of this, Fernando, is that you're not doing it for the metrics, but you know that in serving your students, metrics that can tell your story of impact are important. Heretofore, you know, we've looked at things like graduation rates, which look at traditional students and traditional profiles and traditional institutions and traditional pathways, right? If you're not a first-time, full-time student, you don't count in those measures. And that still seems to be the preponderance in public policy and others. So Alam, let me just ask you a little bit about, you know, you've shown the economic mobility index that Lanae shared that we've been talking about and others. From the perspective of Fresno, if you had to say, here are the priorities that we as an institution have when we make commitment to enroll a student to ensure they graduate, what are the kinds of metrics and strategies that you have in place to ensure the students that choose to enroll with you are successful?
I think the philosophy probably from all of us is that when we admit a student, we're making a commitment to do everything that we can to ensure that they can be as successful as they can be. Right. And every student is different. Every student has their own challenges, their own strengths, their own experiences. And so in terms of our strategy, we have first year experiences that really introduce our students to each other and to the life on the campus and the opportunities and the supports that are available, and then just try and build them through the program. You know, we're judged by graduation rates the same as everyone else, but we disaggregate the data as far as we can because we recognize that within our student body, there are so many different stories and groups that need specialized different support. And Fernando is right. You know, it's really about the alumni that tell our story the best and the impact that the education they've had here has had on them, and that's really what we rely on to tell our story, I think.
Yeah, thanks. You know, I can appreciate the individual story of students and their success, as some of that is through the metrics. We also have to be pretty pragmatic. You all are at institutions that don't have very high level of resources for what impact you're having in society, right? And this is one measure that shows a little bit more of that. So looking at individuals and graduates that can tell their individual stories powerful, but also looking institutionally, right? So Maggie, you know, there you are at UT Rio Grande Valley, which is literally on the cusp, like on the border between Texas and Mexico, and you serve a very population that has a very low cost of living and approach and low income, but you're seeing significant impact. How are you seeing that impact of your institution in the society where you're grounded in the service area and the impact it's making on the community?
Well, I think, you know, our graduation rates at the end of the day, as much as, you know, sometimes all those metrics are a bit cumbersome, right, and a bit overwhelming. None of us would be here today if it wasn't for what we do for students. And at the end, the success of a student is that they graduate, right? And so we've put in place some programs, like in our student success area, we have a graduation help desk that is really monitoring that a student is making progress in addition to advising, right, to ensure that a student is completing their degree. And what we're seeing, I've been in the Rio Grande Valley 17 years now, and what a difference I have seen in population growth, in changes in the economy. At our institution, we have a brand new medical school. And so you begin to see, and obviously metrics like this really show that we don't just impact that one individual student when they graduate with a degree, we impact their entire family. And that's what we're here to do.
Yeah. No, we know that you all are committed. We're so grateful at Excelencia to work with your institutions for that reason. It can be very inspiring, but also very challenging, because I don't want to lose sight of the fact that, you know, those that get the most resources, the institutions that get the most resources, are those that are perceived as being very selective, very prestigious, and using metrics that we don't necessarily look well in as HSIs, and intentional HSIs as your institutions are. Fernando, you as leading an institution like this, you know, how do we find ways to bring greater attention to the work you're doing? These metrics might be one. I appreciate you saying that it's for branding, but you don't focus on the metrics per se. But how do we leverage more resources to elevate the kind of student support services and the structural change you're making to intentionally serve your students?
Sure. So at least here, I've decided that everything is local. And so, you know, I used to work in the Midwest, and sometimes working with state and other kinds of legislators was difficult. I benefit. So by being radically local, by owning that Lehman is of, by, and for the Bronx, I recognize that a significant number of our elected officials are alums or have an immediate family member who's an alum. Not only that, many of their staffs are our alums. And so I make it a point to meet with our state and local and federal legislators on a regular basis. And we make the rounds. And what's wonderful about that is that they care about Lehman and the other constituents of the Bronx Community College and Hostos Community College. And so which are important feeders to us. And so as a consequence, the conversations begin with, what are you doing? What do you need help with? And so we don't start with the rankings. We don't start with, well, the US News said this, or we don't start with, what are your ACT scores? We start with questions like, I saw that your student of color male rate is only 32%. What are we going to do to make that better? And so it creates a mutual understanding to look beyond the superficial data, to look for more meaningful stuff underneath. And they're looking for ways not to batter us, but to understand us, and most importantly, collaborate. because they understand if we can help solve social and economic mobility problems in the Bronx, we are helping their policy agenda as well. And so we become important partners in this step, in the same way that we're partners with the Chamber of Commerce. So I have found my conversations with elected officials here to be very unlike conversations I would typically have in places like Minnesota or Wisconsin, or even in Arizona for that matter. But that was a long time ago. And so I appreciate the fact that it is a conversation. It is not a sharing of facts, but it's really a conversation meant to understand and collaborate.
Yeah. Thanks, Fernando. You know, Maggie, some of this is that deeper dive, and I know that that your institution as well as alums have earned the seal of Excelencia, because you can show with data, practice, and leadership what you are doing to be intentional in serving and trying to measure what you value, which is looking at the service area. To Fernando's point overall, do you have, I know you're doing so many things, but if you could highlight, two things that you believe can help us understand the critical work UTRGV is doing and why you're making that move in economic mobility. Can you share with us kind of what those two things are of your efforts?
So I think one is financial and one is academic, right? They go hand in hand. So on the financial side, we have multiple programs and are extremely intentional in our programming of any type of funds that we have. And so in the state of Texas, we set aside a certain part of our tuition to go towards students and low-income students. And so we have a program that's called the UTRGV Tuition Advantage that we've been able in the last couple of years to adjust. And so our students who meet certain qualifications, but most importantly, who have an income level of $125,000 or less, will have their tuition paid for and mandatory fees. We also cap our tuition and we have a 4-year guarantee program. So we really work from a financial standpoint to remove as many barriers as possible, right? So that they're not worried about that. We have a great student success team. We have wonderful faculty. One of the areas that we're really trying to grow is something we call TL, which is our peer-led team program, which is similar to supplemental instruction. And we're seeing some really great results in that area through our student success area and just really helping our students continue to be successful in the classroom with their peers so that they're comfortable with who they're working with on the academic side.
That's great. I know that there's a lot going on. I think part of what we know the three of you are doing, I mean, your institutions are very concrete in serving your students. I know it's hard to have a conversation in a short period of time to address that. I know, Maggie, you just mentioned two very thoughtful strategies. They're very holistic. I know we talk about the affordability issue, which is, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but summarizing the affordability and the support services that you're doing to make sure that the students feel seen and engaged overall. Those take resources and effort. So I'm going to ask you, and then I'll jump to Alan, but how are you investing in that? Where does that come from to make sure that you can address those challenges or barriers for students?
So, sorry, my light keeps going off. I apologize for that. It's about setting priorities, and our priorities, as I've said, is a team effort, from our president to our provost, really working together as we look at the budgets. And I'll give you an example. We all know that we're losing employees, right? And student employees, because they can go across the street and make a little bit more money. But what do we know about work study? We know that if a student is employed on campus, they're about 8 times more likely to graduate than if they're not, right? And so we knew there was an issue coming out of this pandemic as a team work together with our student employment office, with our financial aid office, our finance area, and the support of all our leadership to increase our minimum wage for our students to $12 an hour. That's a $4 million investment. We didn't get additional work study. It was kind of digging deep in the pockets of our finance areas and making this a priority of our institution, because we know students working on campus is the best way to make them successful. And so it really is about digging deep, having support at all levels, and making some tough decisions.
Thanks, Maggie. And I think I would complement that by saying it's also, you know who you're serving and you're finding ways to serve them well, which is key, because you're disproportionately Hispanic student enrollment, and you know what their needs are in your service area. So appreciate the thoughtfulness and getting ahead and the intentionality of your efforts. Alam, I'll ask in a slightly different way, but you think about if we had more resources available, given the really kind of innovative things I think Fresno State is doing, some that are basic and core and some that are more innovative. If you had more resources to be able to invest, what are the top 2 things you would be doing at Fresno State to invest in the kind of students and success that you're seeing overall?
Well, that's a hard question. We don't get to think about
I know.
what to do with more resources very often. It's usually the reverse paradigm. I know that on our campus, it's always that compromise between cost and services that we can provide, right?
Yeah.
Maggie was talking about this earlier. One of the things that we've been very intentional about in recent years is that convergence of student support services and the academic side. Historically, that's been very segmented, and we've recognized that you can't treat the whole student, you can't help the whole student without considering all of the different aspects of that. And so, we've been able to align things a little bit better by working together, but we still have huge needs in student support, things like advising and tutoring and supplemental instruction. And, this is another area where it's a great opportunity for our students to be hired and to work with their fellow students and see and learn from each other. But I would say that in terms of, if someone dropped a bucket of money on me right now, that's the first place where we go out and invest. And the other area, thinking ahead and building on what we've learned over the last couple of years, is in the area of technology and infrastructure, that there are so many opportunities that we've discovered over the last 2.5 years in terms of other ways that we can serve our students with technology. But in our area, there's a challenge that our students just can't afford the technology. And so investing in ways that support our students with access to broadband and devices that allow them to take advantage of all these new ways of learning that we've discovered is a high priority for us too. Great.
Thanks. I know that like how time is flying. I wanted to, Fernando, get back to you as well, because we talk about, you all are top 10 in the nation when you use metrics that look at economic mobility. We've talked a little bit about some of what we're doing in the perspective of focusing on a service area and showing your intentionality. You're the president of this institution. And, if you had, we could ask for an investment of resources of the things that you are doing that you think it can be scaled up and get you even further in the progress and the commitment you're making to students, what would you focus on? The top 2 things that you think, Fernando, those who are listening in should understand and see about why Lehman College is top 10 in economic mobility.
Well, apart from more faculty, more resources, I'd say also advising. And I don't mean just academic advising, but sort of that trio SSS kind of mentality of holistic coaching and mentoring that. And then, it's part of an initiative here on campus and across CUNY, but we really need to get our students networked and resourced to do well in those career jobs. And I think if we could continue to expand what we're doing on those 2 fronts, right? Get them internships, get them career mentoring, that could be helpful. If you said you've got an unlimited pocket of money, and I could change some state laws, affordable housing on campus. We have no housing. And so we are buffeted by what the market demands in the Bronx. And so we can hold down our prices, we can increase our scholarships, we can increase summer funding or work study jobs on campus, but we can't control what the external market does in New York City in terms of housing prices. And if we could contain and control that for a large segment of our students, that would make a huge difference in terms of creating stability and predictability for them.
Yeah, thank you. I think lots of areas where, and I appreciate, Alum, your comment. Rarely do we get the opportunity to think about if we had access to significant resources where we could spend them. We're often asked to cut back or do more with less. It feels like so many HSIs, that's the reality, that we're always trying to do more with less. What I appreciate about what all of you have shared is that your commitment to do well and right by students and kind of fulfill that social contract when they choose to enroll with you. Your commitment to try and make sure they get to and through to serve them and the community is clear. And I think part of our challenge is making sure at Excelencia, Third Way, and some of you who are on this call, is that how do we make sure that we pay attention and measure what we value? And if the goal of higher ed education is to make sure that we have kind of economic and social mobility, are we looking at the metrics that we value to tell the story of institutions like this and the stories of their students and the institutions in a robust way? And I know that we've just touched the surface. I hope each of you will take a look at these 3 institutions, what they're doing, the top 10, the HSIs, and those that have earned the seal of Excelencia. They're showing that intentionality and having impact beyond the traditional measures and efforts. That should be what we value as the population continues to grow in diversity and effort and opportunity overall. So I want to make sure we've got, I think, a lot of questions, and I know that our colleagues have been very generous. I hope you will follow up with each of the 3 institutions. They have a lot more work to share, and we're happy to do that and bring attention to good work like this. I'd like to make sure that Nicole has an opportunity to ask our panelists the questions, and maybe Lanae can join us as well.
Thank you, Deb and Maggie and Alam and Fernando. I mean, we do a lot of events at Third Way, and I have to say this feels like, without question, the most robust and at the very least, the most engaging conversation in the chat. And relatedly and unsurprisingly, we have some really, really thoughtful questions. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to try to get as many of them answered as possible, combine where I can. So the first one, which also feels particularly timely given the way we've seen COVID exacerbate existing kind of inequalities across the higher education system. You've all touched a little bit on kind of academic specific related supports that you extend to your students. But what are your institutions doing to address the increase in the need for mental health and wellness support for Hispanic students? As we are all aware, culturally speaking, many Hispanics are not necessarily open or encouraged to seek out help of this variety. So anyone that feels kind of moved to address that can unmute themselves and do so.
Maggie, I think you all are doing some good work, right?
So appreciate that. That is an excellent question, and something that I can't tell you that we have solved. I'm not sure that anybody has, and you're right, the pandemic just really shed a bright light on some of these issues, but it also helped us in finding new ways to address these. And so I think part of why we didn't see as much in this area is because students didn't necessarily want to come into the counseling center, right? Because then they'd be identified. And so one of the things through the pandemic that we've added is telecounseling support services so that our students feel comfortable getting these services without having to come into a location. That has made a big difference for us.
I'm muted. Thank you, Maggie. Fernando, Alam, any additions, contributions to that question?
I mean, mental health is part of 2 of our initiatives that we've submitted to the state and local legislators for additional support. It was a key thing. I came late relative to how COVID hit the Bronx, but I would comment that in my first 60 days, everybody that I encountered on campus had a story of how devastated their neighborhood in the Bronx was by COVID. And so it's a very traumatized area. And so, and you've got multi-generational families, and oftentimes you have our students who are caught in between those other generations. They're raising their children and they're caring for older folks at home as well. And so that isolation that they felt during COVID was profound. That sense of community that was so important when we were open was lost, and the ability to access. It took a minute for us as a campus to figure out how to do services and education well in a distance environment, and we're getting better at that. To Maggie's point, this is not you don't solve this problem. You manage it as well as you can with the complexities. And so right now we're trying to figure out ways that we can work with students as they come back to campus in greater numbers, but also to continue our capacity to serve and reach out to those students remotely. Because we are, in fact, as Maggie pointed out, working with subpopulations that are hesitant to reach out. And so we need to be very careful that when we are doing that work, we're doing it in a culturally responsible and sensitive way.
Right. If I could just add to that, Fernando, because we saw in some of our work, so many institutions were using the CARES HERF support that they received because of the pandemic and zeroing in on this as they became more aware. So there are a lot of examples that we can follow up with as well. Wouldn't say any of them are perfect, but acknowledging, knowing who they're serving and finding ways to support them well has really been important.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add that we're fortunate in our system that there were targeted resources to address mental health and basic needs in recent budgets, but it's never enough. Even going back pre-pandemic, we knew, right, that mental health was a real challenge for our students, and through the pandemic, things just got more and more challenging. Our institutional research office had flash surveys periodically just to check in with students and see how they're doing, and it was very, very difficult for them. And really, as Fernando was saying, that lack of community and connection to others during that time was very difficult. So we're still figuring out how to best help our students as they come back.
Thank you. So there are a couple questions here that kind of get at what other metrics can we be tracking? Do we have kind of access to data for outside of college completion that help us understand the value of a higher education institution and whether or not we're actually providing students with a good outcome? Let's see. Looking sometimes at only graduation rates can be insufficient, right? Especially because we know a lot of students don't just go to get the degree, they go to get what the degree can offer them, which is, gainful employment, a good life, satisfying job. So what outside of graduation rates do we have access to from a federal data perspective, and what else can we be paying attention to measure the value of an institution's degree?
I'll jump in on that. And I know, Lanae, you need to think about that too. And then Fernando, if you want to jump in on that too, I think part of what we're hearing from our colleagues is that it's not just a one and done, it's where the institution's intentionality and their investment is. So like for the Seal of Excelencia, we look at enrollment, retention, transfer, financial support, faculty, staff representation, and completion. All of those are publicly available data from institutions that show an institution might not control who enters and who crosses the stage completely, but what happens in between that educational enterprise, they have ways to measure and engage, and we need to value that as a way of understanding the outcomes. And I think that's, so I would just suggest that and would defer to Fernando if you have other things, but we don't capitalize on a holistic story of an institution if we just look at outcomes, because some students do well despite the institution, not because of it. And we're looking at institutions that are intentional and doing well and helping students with their efforts. Fernando, I think you're muted.
Yeah, no, Deborah, I completely agree with you. I was going to say, you can always go to the clearinghouse and find out where your students went to, but that's if they go to other higher ed institutions, and that's important. I mean, we do have a phenomenon of reverse transfer, right? Students start at community college, they come here, they decide that the four-year degree is not what they need or want right now. They go back to the community college. That doesn't mean that they haven't done something powerful for their own social mobility or don't have a good job as a result. And so we look at things systemically because obviously our students move between and amongst our campuses in the city. I'd say the other thing that you can do periodically, but it's costly and it's time consuming. And that is whether you do it in-house or get somebody from outside to help you, you can work with your alums, you can skim social media, you can find out those students who left you, how are they doing? Maybe they're not doing well and they're not going to respond, but maybe a number of them have gotten enough from you that they are doing well. And it's important to know what their stories are. Are they open to come back? Do they need additional training? Why did they leave? What did they get from us that they think allowed them to be successful? Because we still want to know that, right? If they were still successful after they left short of completing a degree, that still might mean they had a powerful and useful experience with us. And so we want to know what that is. The other thing that we can do internally is we have a robust non-degree center, which is about 4 miles down the road here on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. We have students that start there as non-degree students taking language classes, taking certification programs that then migrate into degree programs or vice versa. And we want to know what that ladder looks for them, going up and going down. Because again, students are stepping in and stepping out of higher education options to fulfill personal and professional goals. And so if they stop out, if they pause because they've met a certain professional goal, we'd like to know what that is and then continue that conversation with them. And so that center always allows for professional development and growth, and also allows us an opportunity to say, and if that next stage still requires you to come back or encourages you to come back and get an undergraduate or graduate degree, you know what that pathway is. And so that conversation, to Deborah's point, it is a holistic approach, because what you want to do is constantly be in conversation with the students. Why? They will tell you something about you. They will give you way more data than you could possibly even manage, but they'll tell you. And then thirdly, you can start to visualize what their pathways are through the institution, and then find out where their blockages or barriers that may be stopping them. And you can work on those things to see if you can facilitate more of that walkthrough through the institution.
I think all of that is so important. And I'll just add, Deborah noted the limitations in data that is available. It's so important to look at success for whom, right? Who are you serving well? And one of the limitations on that right now is that we have a ban on collecting the data that we might need in order to dig into that question further. So it's one of the reasons that we and so many of our partners are really focused on passing the College Transparency Act, because that would allow us to collect the disaggregated data that we really would need in order to have a fulsome look at how these folks are doing.
And I think we have time for one more quick question, which is, do your institutions enroll undocumented students? That's what I figured. That was going to be a short answer. I think with that,
I want to add this, Nicole. I mean,
yes, please.
Not only do they enroll them, I think the whole purpose, especially these three, is that they are looking to serve them. So it's not a fait accompli. We just enroll them and let them go with God, figure it out for themselves how they get through. These are institutions that are taking the time to make sure that they get services as well. So our undocumented students get the same social contract as others. And I'm confident, because I know the three very well, that they're also doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's another question here that I don't know that we have time to necessarily dive into, but I just want to leave you all with this because I think it's so kind of wholly representative of the reason that we came together to have this conversation, which is there any metric that includes the cost of embedding like into society immigrants that are enrolled in higher education, right? And so again, I think who knows what the future holds. I think we need to ask our friends on Capitol Hill what that would look like, but I really interpret that as, you know, the reason that a lot of the schools with the historical prestige continue to see themselves as #1 and #2 on college rankings is because they are incredibly selective with the students that they enroll, oftentimes to their detriment. And so this is an awesome, awesome, awesome example. And I'm so grateful for you all and for you all sharing your time with us today. To learn about what institutions of higher education are doing across the country to not only enroll, Deborah, as you said, Hispanic students, but to really ensure that they get across the finish line and that we are moving the needle on Latino student success. So thank you all for joining us today. From DC to Guatemala City, we are so incredibly grateful. We will be posting the Zoom recording of this conversation on both of our websites, Excelencia and Education and Third Way, very shortly. So thank you all and be well.